tonight's program. If everybody could quiet down, we're about to begin the official program, and find a seat. If you can't find a seat, there's some over here. You can take a chair and pull it where you like. We're all very flexible here about seating. Turn your phones off if you would. And make your way to the seat because the program's going to begin. Boy, there's just a lot of energy and activity tonight. This is great. I love it. It must be summertime. My name is Lissa Weinman, and I'm a member of the board of Windham World Affairs Council. And there's other board members here too. Most of you know Windham World Affairs Council. We do monthly programs available for free or by donation. We depend on these donations to make these programs accessible for all, so thank you for your generosity. And we're really excited tonight because we are doing our first collaboration, I hope it's not the last, with the Kopkind Colony. Some of you might know about the Kopkind Colony. It was founded in memory of Andy Kopkind, who was a gutsy, groundbreaking gay journalist who helped found The Nation magazine, make it what it is today. And every summer, Kopkind Colony in Guilford has camps where they have a wonderful kind of collaborative, intergenerational effort with young people who are activists and filmmakers. So many of those young people are with us today, and we're really pleased to have you. Thank you for coming. And the Kopkind Colony is also going to be doing a free movie night this Saturday at 7 p.m., where they're going to be showing the film Israelism, which is a look at Israel through the eyes of, mostly I've watched the film, so I can say, young Jewish people who go on the Birthright program and go to Israel and what they find. So it's a very illuminating program. There'll be a couple of speakers from Western Massachusetts that are going to come and discuss the film afterward. And I hope Joanne can tell us all more later on about who's coming. In the meantime, I want to just tell you about a couple of the upcoming Windham World Affairs Council programs. Some of you might know that we've been involved in this America 250 program, where we're looking at American identity leading up to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States in July 2026. So we've been doing town halls and different programming where we're really taking a deep dive into American identity and trying to figure it all out, basically. So on August 29th, we don't have an exact location yet, but on August 29th, we're going to be doing our annual Galbraith lecture in honor of John Kenneth Galbraith, who was the economist we should have been all turning to all these years, not Milton Friedman. But at any rate, his son, Peter Galbraith, has been doing an annual lecture, but this year we're going to be welcoming Tim Reeser, who some of you might know was Senator Leahy's 37-year chief of staff in the Senate, and is now a senior advisor to Senator Welch. And there'll be a conversation about the future of American foreign policy with Peter Galbraith and Tim Reiser on August 29th. It's a Thursday evening. Stay posted for exact date and location, because that's forthcoming. Also on September 25th, we'll be doing our next town hall meeting with Meg Mott. Some of you know she's the Constitution Wrangler, and we're doing these town halls every fall and spring with Meg, leading up to the 250th anniversary. And in this town hall at Brooks Library on September 25th, she'll be examining the First Amendment and the right to protest. And there'll be more information about that on our website. You can take a look. Also, a talk that we had for August scheduled that will now be in October on Ukraine will be happening in October. So As usual, we have great programming, monthly salons. We encourage everybody to become a member of Windham World Affairs Council. It's how we keep things going. And it's a great group of people. Many of our board members are here. There's Scott Cooper running our online programming right here. We have Tamara Sten, who's the chair of our board back there. Claire Morgana. We have our new board member, Caitlin. I don't know who else is here, but if everybody who's a board member can just raise their hand. If anybody wants to get more information, we've got Jim Kirby and Paul Love here as well. Thank you so much for your help today, Paul, too. So there's a lot of us here. Ask us about joining and the different perks of membership. Now I'd like to introduce Chuck Collins. Without Chuck, this program wouldn't be happening. He is a Windham World Affairs Council member, but he also directs the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington. He told me that Margaret Cerullo, it was his favorite professor he's ever had, and he's so excited to welcome her here tonight. Chuck just wrote his first novel, Altar to an Erupting Sun, and he's also the author of many books, including Born on Third Base, which was a New York Times bestseller, and The Wealth Hoarders, and he's been doing a tremendous job on climate activism, which has been a real inspiration to me and many others in the room. So thank you for being here tonight. Welcome to everybody from CopKind. Thank you to all of our volunteers and the people who made dinner possible tonight. We thank you from the bottom of our heart for your delicious food. And please welcome Chuck Collins.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks to Lisa and John for creating this amazing space at 118 that allows us to be all together here. And yeah, I also want to extend my own thrilled greetings to be doing an event with people from CopKind Colony. There are a dozen young people here who are here for a week of journalists and organizers together. And they are really strategizing and thinking about this moment that we're in. So I want to give a real welcome to the young leaders who are here from CopKind, including two from Brattleboro. This summer we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the CopKind Colony in August. So there's going to be a great party in Guilford, up there at Packers Corner, up a holler. That's where the CopKind Colony has been doing its thing for 25 years. So I'm thrilled to welcome Margaret here to Brattleboro. Margaret Cerullo is a professor emerita at Hampshire College, where she taught sociology and feminist studies. She retired recently after teaching for 46 years, which is remarkable to think she started teaching at 12. I got to know her, I think, in sort of year 3 to 7. And I learned recently we're not that far apart in age, but when you're looking up to a professor, they seem decades of wisdom older. Anyway, so that's still the case, though. And you'll see very soon why she was not only my favorite professor, but touched a lot of people and shaped a lot of activists and people doing work in the world. She's been involved, in addition to teaching, very involved in Mexico and observing the Zapatista movement since its public emergence in January 1994, which after 10 years underground, the Zapatista movement emerged. And she's organized field study and connections and brought students and other activists to the state of Chiapas in Mexico. And she is a part of a group called the Lightning Collective, which has worked to translate some of the Zapatista communiques and the writings of Subcommandante Marco. And so she's part of the group that translated this, and we have copies for sale tonight. Everyone's books is here, and it's terrific. The stories are like parables and very informative, and then Lightning Collective has provided some commentaries as well. And In January this year, Margaret went back for the 30th anniversary, the 40th anniversary of 40 years of organizing of the Zapatista movement, which required, kind of traveling hours and hours up on rural roads, up into the Lacandon jungle for a wild party in the jungle and a commemoration. So we've asked her to talk about that. But we're also going to lean on her to give us some thoughts on the most recent Mexican election, with the election of the first woman president of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum, and sort of what does that mean and what does that foretell. So please give Margaret a Brattleboro welcome.
Thank you. Well, I just want to start by plugging Chuck's novel, which I had the pleasure of reading since I learned of its publication. And I read it as a sort of ethnography of the social movements of the last almost 45 years in Western Mass and Southern Vermont. So if any of you have been in any way sort of in this ambiance, I think you'll find your own histories kind of illuminated. So yes, Altar to an Erupting Sun. It's beach reading, it's serious library reading, anyway. So thank you all, and it's a thrill to have all the Kopkind campers here, to see old friends like Jana Schreiber, who I knew from Cambridge and then would run into in Chiapas. She was working on certifying organic coffee and what that process was about. Quincy Saul, who popped in from another part of Vermont. Anyway, and it's thrilling to be with all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to talk, first I'm going to talk about this book, but really it's a pretext to talk about the history of the Zapatistas and why they're so significant, why they have inspired several generations since they emerged into the light 30 years ago, all right? So what's the origin story of this book? Stories for Dreaming Another World. We began the project of translating the Zapatista stories, translating this volume, which you see, Los Otros Cuentos, which was produced by an Argentine Solidarity collective in 2012, and actually produced in a recovered factory in Buenos Aires. And the idea was to raise money for the Zapatistas and also to make their work and their movement known in this really compelling literary form. And we called ourselves Colectivo Relámpago, which means lightning collective, because we thought we were going to produce a very rapid translation, again, as a solidarity project. Well, it took us 12 years. And so our name turned out to be ironic, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But in the meantime, this was the original, Los Otros Cuentos, and this is a Zapatista primary school, and I'm not sure which came first, but I suspect that they took this image from the side of this primary school and made it into the cover of the book. And just an indication that the book was really read by young Zapatistas and their teachers. It was the Zapatista secondary school students who helped the Argentine solidarity activists choose their favorite stories. Several other collections were published after 1912, sorry. It wasn't 2012 even, it was 2010. And I know this is a stereotype, but the Germans were right out in front in 2010. They published their edition. In 2012, it was the Norwegians. And the French managed to get one out in 2014. Italians trailing, as is often true, in 2016, and they even published a second volume in Spanish before we managed to get our book out. So rather than lightning, our speed was the speed of the caracol, which is a recurrent Zapatista image, the snail shell, which has multiple meanings, which I could allude to. But the idea of the caracol is we advance, but slowly. And that's because we're going so far. So the question is, what took us so long? Well, as we began to, after we translated the stories, or as we were translating them, we began to investigate the context of their publication. They often emerged as part of a communique that the Zapatistas issued, and they issued tons of communiques, especially in the early 20 years of their public existence, and oftentimes there would be a story embedded in one of the communiques. So what we really wanted to resist was the sort of idea of the indigenous, and they tell stories, and they're very mythical and mystical. All of these stories were political interventions, and we wanted to make that clear. And so that's how we began writing commentaries to the stories. And as we began investigating, we discovered layer upon layer that we never imagined. All sorts of narrative labyrinths that these rabbit holes, however you prefer to describe it, the stories took us into. And so we just continued. It took us 12 years to sort them out. The one way we've described this collection then is that it's an accidental archive of the Zapatista movement. It's not a canon in any way. So with all of that, that's the origin story of the book. But now I want to speak to something more significant, which is the origin story of the Zapatistas. And I'm going to take you back to 1994. Are there some people, anybody who wasn't born in 1994? Or so shortly thereafter, 30 years ago. And the widespread surprise at what seemed at the very least ill-timed. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, after the electoral defeat of the Sandinistas in 1990, as the civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala were winding down, when the time of the guerrilla, and the guerrilla meaning the revolutionary armed popular movement that overthrew the state, or whose aim was to overthrow the state, the time of the guerrilla seemed decisively over. It was then that an army of indigenous men and women, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN, appeared from the mountains of the Mexican southeast to declare war on the Mexican state. On January 1st, 1994, the very day that the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, known as the TLC in Mexico, the Tratado de Libre Comercio, the very day that NAFTA went into effect, which was supposed to mark Mexico's entry into the first world. And in fact, one of the very first demonstrations and one of the very first books about the Zapatistas was under the banner, First World, ha, ha, ha. And so we subsequently learned why this coincidence of timing. What did NAFTA represent for the indigenous people of Chiapas and really for all of Mexico? It was a death sentence. Since in order to enter the treaty, the NAFTA treaty, the US required that Mexico revise Article 27 of its constitution. And Article 27 was the article that embodied the gains of the Mexican Revolution under the slogan of Emiliano Zapata, the land belongs to those who work it. And it was through Article 27 that since the early part of the 20th century, land reform happened to some extent in Mexico, coming very late, as does everything, to Chiapas. But that was the significance of Article 27. When in Mexico, when I'm not in Chiapas, I live in Cuernavaca, which is Morelos, which is the state of Emiliano Zapata. And around this time, there is in Cuernavaca, in a very prominent place, there was the roundabout or Glorieta de Zapata with a great statue of Zapata mounted on it. And around this time, that statue was taken down, disappeared for many years, and relocated somewhere on the side of a highway. Nobody can find it. So this is a very significant moment, trying to erase the memory, the history, and the material effects of the Mexican Revolution. As I said, for the indigenous, it was a death sentence. It meant the end of agrarian reform and their over 500 years struggle to reclaim their land, the source of life, livelihood, identity, and power. Again, to bring you back and to recall for those of you who lived through it, David Graeber, the great anarchist theorist, once described the years before 1994 as probably the worst ever to be a leftist. Utopia had moved from left to right, and it was embodied in neoliberalism. This was the time of an intensified form of capital, neoliberal capitalism, and intensified US hegemony, unchecked by the Soviet Union or any other as yet powerful force. So in that context, the Zapatista emergence was an event in the philosopher's sense. What makes possible the restitution of the inexistent, those present in the world, but absent from its meaning and decisions. And again, we are in the moment of, some of you may remember it through Thatcher, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative. This was capital triumphant. Or John Berger evoked Hieronymus Bosch's Hell, a strange prophecy. He said Bosch's painting was a prophecy of the mental climate that we are living in with globalization and the new economic order. There is no horizon. Everywhere there are surprises and sensations, yet nowhere is there any outcome. Nothing flows through, everything interrupts. There is a kind of spatial delirium, which he tried to capture in this famous painting, and Berger proposed that today a comparable incoherence, a comparable wilderness of separate excitements, a similar frenzy characterized our world. Andy Kopkind, writing in The Nation, captured the moment. The revolt of the Chapanecos is something stunningly new. The first shots of a rebellion consciously aimed at the New World Order. It might be that the battle in Chiapas, he wrote, will end with the predictable bangs and whimpers heard whenever outnumbered, outgunned peasants without powerful international support are picked off and packed away. But the shouts fired in Mexico in the first week of the new year have been heard around the world, and their echoes will not soon stop. No, I think that what was unexpected in this moment is that the Zapatista dream became a globalized dream for a life of dignity, collectivity, and justice, shared by so many in the face of the global nightmare. And I remember once hearing a guy from the MST, the workers' movement in Brazil, in Chiapas in the 90s, who captured what my experience of the uprising was. He said to the Zapatistas, you said to all of us who hoped for a different world, you are not alone. So 1994, I just happened to arrive in Chiapas to study Spanish because my daughter was in a bilingual kindergarten, and I'd been working on the journal Radical America, which was a 60s, it was the journal of SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, that had migrated to Boston, became a sort of journal of the new social movements. We had just put to bed an issue of the magazine called Living Without an Alternative. And we closed it up in December of '93, went to Mexico on January 1st, when out of the mountains of the Mexican Southeast came the Zapatista movement. So it intersected for me, in a very particular way. And I just, again, thinking, because of being with all you young folks, I thought another way to locate 1994 is that was the year that Jeff Bezos founded Amazon. in his father's garage as a book distribution project, just to again take us back to another moment in time. Okay, so the question I want to try to answer conceptually, which will also be a way of taking you through the history of the movement, is what sets the Zapatistas apart from other revolutionary movements, both in terms of their philosophy and their mode of organizing. Okay. Well, it was the first guerrilla that fully incorporated women and a feminist perspective. And that has everything to do with the timing. The feminist movement had arisen and grown and spread throughout Latin America by the time the Zapatistas began organizing in the mid-'80s. And I love this picture. This was found, this is graffiti on the streets of Chiapas, January 1st, 1994, that commemorates the fact that the city of San Cristobal was taken by Major Ana Maria, an indigenous woman comandanta. And in fact, Subcommandante Marcos later commented just at that moment, when an indigenous woman had commanded troops that occupied the city of the old colonial capital of San Cristobal, the media was completely uninterested in her and much more interested in the mestizo with green eyes behind the ski mask. But, I mean, he did add a certain charismatic element to the emergence of the Zapatistas on the world stage, and some of you may remember his interview with tourists where he asked them to forgive us, excuse us for the inconvenience, but we haven't made a revolution before. And again, this is just another of the iconic images of the early years of the rebellion. I find it, if you look at it closely, it's pretty extraordinary. Bare-handed women pushing back fully armed soldiers and leaving them in a state of complete shock. And then, I don't know if I'll actually be able to show this. Sometimes it works, and sometimes I can't get the video to show. But I love this. Recently, the Zapatistas have had several women's encounters where they've asked women of the world to come and share their project with them. And in preparation for the women's meetings, Zapatista women decided they had to learn to drive. They couldn't be dependent on the men. And not only did they have to learn to drive, but they had to learn to do car mechanics. I love it because it reminded me so much of the second wave of the women's movement. I don't know if any of you were part of feminist projects where we learned car mechanics, and feminists, yes, set up, the only garage that any of us would think of going to was one run by a woman during the years of the 70s. So the Zapatista women were absolutely committed to becoming chauffeurs or drivers. And they're so tiny, and these trucks are so huge, but they're supposed to be learning how to maneuver obstacles. You'll see what's funny about this. They knock them down. They don't go around them. And then they cheer. It's hysterically funny. I can send you, and it's really great watching them, lift the hoods of these huge trucks and learn how to repair them. Okay, so continuing on, just one thing to finish, and we'll pick it up again, this part on women. One of the first proclamations of the Zapatistas when they came above ground was the Revolutionary Law of Women, which is an articulation of women's rights where the practice of autonomy, the way they've subsequently organized their communities, has concretized those rights and expanded their meanings. So I'd be happy to talk about that because it is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the Zapatista revolution. Okay, so central Zapatista principles, maybe I'll go back and give you the image of the women so I don't overwhelm you with words. A central notion of the Zapatistas is they want to create a world in which many worlds fit. And another way that they talk about that is they insist on making space for difference. And this grows out of their particular condition as indigenous in Mexico. We want to be Mexican, they demand, without ceasing to be indigenous. That is, without assimilating to a mestizo identity that would eliminate and suppress their indigenous histories and pasts. So it's a notion of citizenship very hard to come by in Latin America that recognize simultaneously equality and difference. But more than that, I would say, the Zapatistas have distinguished themselves from other left revolutionary movements by openly embracing the many differences that have often undone the left. Not only differences of race and ethnicity, but also of sexuality and gender. And the prominence of sex workers, of LGBTQ people, of trans Zapatistas has certainly been a notable feature of their movement, and I will refer to that as I go along. Okay, secondly, and connected to creating a world in which many worlds fit, is their principle of caminar preguntando. And this, for those of you who understand Spanish, this presented us with a lot of translation problems. We walk while, sometimes we thought we walk while asking questions, we walk while listening, and we finally decided we walk by asking questions. And what that encapsulates is the notion that the shape of the struggle, its demands and its goals and its means cannot be set in advance, but must be shaped by those one encounters in struggle along the way. So to my mind, this undermines the rigidity of most traditional left movements that thought and continue to think that they know what the goal is, what the destination is, and how to get there. Okay? So central, by contrast to the Zapatistas' practice, their notion of caminar, caminar preguntando is the importance of dialogue and the encuentro. And I've been talking about that a lot this week, or somewhat this week, at Copkind, which is a kind of encuentro. And for the Zapatistas, it's been forced on them because they're isolated by the state's counterinsurgency strategy. So the only way they've been able to meet with supporters and solidarity activists is by inviting them to Chiapas for encuentros. But the encuentro is a space where something really important happens. And if we think of identities not as attributes of individuals, but as relationships, the encuentro is where we become mirrors to one another, and we discover ourselves in the mirror of the other. So the encuentro is a place where a we can be fostered, a we that can struggle together, a collective subject, or a we that experiences solidarity. And this is just a listing of some of the Zapatista encuentros. They have been absolutely nonstop. In August of 1994, under army siege, they called for a national democratic convention that 6,000 people attended. In 1997, they called for an international meeting that came to be known as the Intergalactico because they invited visitors from other galaxies. They weren't sure if any arrived, but they did assure them that they were welcome. In 2013 and 2014, they held the Zapatista Little School. I think, Quincy, did you go? No, just me. They had first and second grade. I'll show you some images. So there are all these women's encuentros that I mentioned, and then a series of encuentros with artists, with scientists, and then the absolutely, completely craziest encuentro of all, which was in 2021, the Zapatistas, when the pandemic was still raging, the Zapatistas decided to take a voyage to Europe to reverse the conquest. Since the Spanish had arrived in Mexico in 1521, and it was also a way for the Zapatistas to return the extraordinary, solidarity. I'm going to go quickly so I can show you the boat because it's unbelievable. There's the boat. That was the first delegation. They called it Squadron 421. 4 men, 2 women, and 1 other, Ultroa, as that is to say, a trans person. And they, that's 4 to 1, that adds up to 7. And, we all know 7 is a magic number. So we were all thinking, why 7? And then they said, I know you're thinking about this, but the real reason is we could only find 7 people who are willing to agree to take a boat across the ocean, and there are 7 of them who had passports. All right, so they arrived in Europe, and the date was very important, but I'm very bad at dates, as all my students will tell you. So they arrived exactly on the day that the conquistadores had set off from Madrid 500 years before. And this is what Marie José, the trans woman who led the delegation, said as she stepped off the gangplank in Madrid. In the name of the Zapatista women, children, men, elderly, and of course others, I declare that from now on, this place, currently referred to as Europe by those who live here, shall be called Tumil Kashem Ka'op, which means rebellious land, or land which does not give in or give up. And that is how it will be known by its own people and by others, for as long as there is at least someone here who does not surrender, sell out, or give up. How great is that? And the other notion that accompanied their trip to Europe to reverse the conquest was the president of Mexico, López Obrador, had recently demanded of the Spanish government that they apologize for the conquest. And the Zapatistas said they were there to say, were not there to ask for an apology because they weren't conquered. Okay. These are kind of fun, so I think I'll just go back and show them to you. Okay, I'll skip that. But these are the invitations to all of these encuentros. The Escuelita was the one that I went to. It was extraordinary. Somehow, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 of us arrived to Chiapas, and they organized us into buses and took us on long journeys and distributed us among 10 or 12 Zapatista communities where we lived with a family for a week and learned on the ground what autonomy meant according to the Zapatistas. So it was a pretty extraordinary experience. And then this says, it seems like you passed into 2nd grade in the Escuela Zapatista, and this time maybe you should come on a bicycle. And this is one of the encuentros of women, and as you welcome to the women of the world, and men are forbidden to enter. And one of the characteristics of Zapatista public events, and really Zapatista daily life, is sports. And I once interviewed a young Zapatista woman and said, well, could you sort of talk about how the rebellion has changed your life? And she thought about it, and she said, before the rebellion, women couldn't play basketball, and now we can. And they are really fierce basketball players and musicians. And again, this is just the other encuentros. That was the one where they, in Conciencias, conscience, where they invited scientists. And this is just a couple of the images that I can't resist of suggesting the intergalactic nature of their encuentros. That's comparte. That one is kind of nice because it was comparte, which was sharing with artists. But you'll notice that this one took place in Oakland, California. So it was a solidarity project. Okay. So I guess I would like to talk about, I want to talk about autonomy because that's one of the things that I think is the most difficult to understand from afar. And what's the meaning of the Zapatista autonomy project? Well, first off, what is the Zapatistas' view of the state? And why have they decided to change the world without seeking state power? It's not that state power corrupts, but that it's useless. The nation state is no longer the seat of power. And one might argue that's the lesson of the pink tide in Latin America, but that's another very complicated discussion, and Linda Farthing could argue with me, but okay. So autonomy, in 2003, after futile attempts to negotiate with the government, where the government always negotiated in bad faith, they would meet with the indigenous and set up all of these, mesa de trabajo, they would go on, and they would finally reach agreements. The indigenous communities would ratify them, and then nothing happened. The presidents of Mexico, successive presidents, refused to take them to the Congress to have them be ratified. In 2000, when Fox came in 2001, he claimed he was going to solve the problem of Chiapas in 5 minutes, and he introduced into the Congress a watered-down version of the famous accords that had been negotiated with the indigenous that the Zapatistas and all other indigenous communities in Mexico rejected. And so it was at that point that the Zapatistas decided that interacting with the state was futile, and they declared autonomy on recuperated land, and that's very important. The land, they recuperated an enormous amount of land since the uprising in 1994, and on that recuperated land they established caracos, which was their name for their autonomous communities. So what is the autonomy project? Well, I think I would argue, it's an ongoing cultural revolution. An act of rebellion transformed itself into a way of living. Autonomy redefines the meaning of revolution. Rather than a suspended moment where liberated when transformation arrives so the collective can rest or lower their guard, revolution in the Zapatistas' conception is a form of living that reaches out to the apparently unattainable horizon of social justice, a perpetual act of negating imposed ways of being, from racist colonial legacies that cast indigenous bodies as scenery for tourists, to the state's offer of social programs that foster dependence and division, to neoliberal projects of dispossession and displacement. And in the case of women, autonomy means resistance to patriarchal social expectations. And in fact, for women have been the propulsive force of autonomy since the beginning, according to Subcommandante Marco, in the years when they were trying to decide in the late 80s and early 90s, when they were consulting with all the communities about whether to take up arms. It was women whose voices were the loudest and most insistent. Ya basta, enough. They refused to be consigned to the death worlds that were their only option. And so the central idea of autonomy is that social relations cannot be changed by decree, but only in practice. And autonomy is about dignity and horizontality, rather than taking power and reinforcing hierarchies, what they call the pyramids of petty tyrants. Okay. So I'm coming to the end of this part, and I just want to talk about the role of storytelling, because after all, this is a collection of Zapatista stories. So that really, the role of storytelling in their movement goes back to the question of the encounter. And the very first encounter that was crucial to the formation of the EZLN, the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, happened in the 1980s when guerrilleros from the north of Mexico, mestizos, came to Chiapas. And who were they? They were of their times. You know, this is like late 80s, early 80s. They were inspired by the Cuban Revolution, which was very, very close in time. You know, Che, the inspiration of Che was all over Latin America. You know, Central America had just been fighting wars that were very close to Chiapas. Anyway, these northern youth, they were in their late 20s, early 30s, college students and professors, some of them, who had learned a terrible lesson in 1968 in Mexico. And I don't know if any of you remember 1968 in Mexico. The one thing you might associate with it is the Mexican Olympics and the Black Power salute at the Mexican Olympics. But what was much less known in the United States, for sure, is that preceding the Olympics, and in order to keep things calm, because the whole world was watching Mexico, there was a massacre of students in 1968 that was literally erased. They killed on the order of 300 to 500 students. It's never been fully established. It was a rainy day, and by the next day, all evidence had been swept away. So many of the young student demonstrators were carted off to jail, and others were disappeared effectively, and it, you know, never accounted for. They were killed by army sharpshooters. It was quite, so that was a deep and profound lesson for young Mexicans, that there was no way to change the Mexican state peacefully, that they would massacre us, they would kill us. And so that's what led to the development of armed guerrilleros inspired by the Cuban Revolution. This is the only way that we're going to be able to change this corrupt, rotting mess. So these young revolutionaries, idealistic, I think Marcos taught, you know, communications, let's say, mass pop culture, stuff, you know, he was a professor of pop culture, imagine that. Anyway, they came to organize the indigenous, to raise their consciousness about the necessity for armed struggle if they were ever going to exit their condition of dispossession and oppression. And they began teaching Marxist theory. And the indigenous responded by saying, well, thanks a lot. We don't understand a word you're saying. Your word is too harsh. Su palabra es muy dura. And what distinguished this one guerrilla group, the Fuerzas de Liberación Nacional, FLN, National Liberation Forces, is they stopped dead in their tracks and they listened. And they didn't continue in the old way that they had inherited. And when they listened, they discovered that the indigenous didn't need to be organized, that they had long and deep traditions of organizing, and they had been fighting concerted battles for 20 years to regain their land. And they realized they had reached a limit. What they wanted from the Northerners was weapons and training in the use of arms. And the other thing that they realized was the importance of stories and storytelling in indigenous communities. Remember, the indigenous population of Chiapas, by design, was largely illiterate, and a crucial way that people communicated ideas and their experiences of organizing. In fact, their entire history of 500 years of resistance against colonial domination was through stories. And they discovered that the communities, each of the communities, had libros parlantes, talking books, elders in the communities who were charged with telling the stories of their histories, their political histories. And so our collection of stories has two different personas who Marcos is the author, but two different personas appear. Old Antonio, who is a mythical figure and a real one, but he was the indigenous person who helped the guerrilleros make connections to the indigenous communities. He was a seasoned organizer and respected elder in his community, and likely one of those libros parlantes, one of those talking books, who informed Marcos and the other guerrilleros of their history. The other set of stories in this collection features Don Dorito of the La Condona, who's a reincarnation of Don Quixote, who wants to have Marcos as his squire. He sees himself as a modern knight-errant. He proclaims himself like Don Quixote, the undoer of wrongs, restless dream of women, aspiration of men, the last and greatest exemplar of those who perform heroic deeds. And what I think is interesting about, and he's always studying neoliberalism and its plan for the domination of the world. And he assesses the subjective conditions and the rightness of the objective conditions. And I think Dorito is Marcos's Marxist alter ego. Dorito means the little hard one. And remember, the indigenous said to Marcos and the other guerrilleros, your word is too hard. So he's the little hard one who, as I said, represents that alter ego. And I'm going to read you, shall I read you one of the stories, and then we can take a break or decide what you want to hear. Okay, this is one of my favorites. The story of the little mouse and the little cat. August 7th, 1995. And this is the period very close to the year and a half after the uprising when they're negotiating with the government. Once upon a time, there was a little mouse who was very hungry and wanted to eat a little bit of cheese that was in the little kitchen of the little house. So the little mouse marched right up to the little kitchen to grab the little bit of cheese. But as it happened, a little cat appeared in front of him, and the little mouse got very frightened and ran away and couldn't get to the little bit of cheese in the little kitchen. So the little mouse thought for some time about how to get the little bit of cheese in the little kitchen, and he came up with this. I know, I'll put out a little saucer of milk, and the little cat will drink it right up, because little cats really like milk. And then, when the little cat is drinking his little saucer of milk and isn't paying attention, I'll go into the little kitchen and grab the little bit of cheese and gobble it down. What a great idea, gloated the little mouse. So the little mouse left to go to look for a little bit of milk. But as it happened, the milk was in the little kitchen. And so when the little mouse tried to go to the little kitchen, the little cat appeared in front of him, and the little mouse got very frightened and ran away and couldn't get to the milk. The little mouse thought for some time about how he could get the milk in the little kitchen, and he came up with this. I know, I'll throw a little bit of fish really far away, and the little cat will run to eat the little fish, because little cats really like eating little fish. Then, when the little cat is eating his little fish and isn't paying attention, I'll go to the little kitchen and get the milk and put it in the little saucer. And when the little cat is drinking the milk and isn't paying attention, I'll go to the little kitchen and grab a little bit of cheese and gobble it down. What a great idea. I think so much. So the little mouse went to look, it's almost over, I promise. Went to look for a little fish, but as it happened, the fish was in the little kitchen. And when the little mouse tried to go to the little kitchen, the little cat appeared in front of him, and the little mouse got very frightened and ran away and couldn't get to the little fish. And so the little mouse saw that the little cheese he wanted, the milk, and the little fish were all in the little kitchen, and he couldn't get there because the little cat wouldn't let him. And so the little mouse said, "Ya basta, enough," and grabbed a machine gun and riddled the little cat with bullets and hurried to the little kitchen and found that the fish, the milk, and the cheese had all gone bad and could no longer be eaten. The little mouse then went back to where the little cat was lying and chopped up his body and made a huge barbecue and then invited over all of his friends, and they had a party and ate barbecued cat and sang and danced and lived very happily. That was when history began. Okay. So, there are many ways to interpret that story. I don't know how you see it, but remember, this is the time when they're negotiating with the government, who's negotiating with a forked tongue. They're pretending to negotiate. It's a game of cat and mouse, essentially, that the Zapatistas have been playing with the government. So I read the story, the more literalist among us, and I said, well, it's obvious. It's a renewed justification for armed struggle. They're trying to prepare their supporters that this nonviolence thing, isn't a principle, it's a tactic, and look what they've left us with no alternative. So, but what my literary friend said, but why the cartoon format? Something else is going on. And maybe the Zapatistas are asking us and asking themselves, are we heroes in an epic drama of revolution, or are we characters in a Tom and Jerry cartoon? And what's so terrific to me about this story and other aspects of Zapatismo that it is continuous with is that this is the most anti-heroic guerrilla that you can imagine, the most anti-heroic, anti-macho. And another place that I've always loved where that becomes apparent is in the very first set of communiques in English that was published very early, Shadows of Tender Fury, edited by Frank Barnicki. There's a preface by Marcos that I really commend to you that people don't read enough. And it's a rewriting of the classic guerrilla memoir, the heroic guerrilla who goes to the mountains and because of his love for the people suffers, hunger and starvation and misery, etc. But because they are committed to the revolution and to justice, they don't mind these hardships and they triumph. Marcos writes about sitting around the campfire trying to figure out which was worse, the nostalgia or the diarrhea. So and there are all sorts of crazy things that happen where, strange animals pop out of radios, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, it's a very different portrait of the guerrilla than the one that we were accustomed to coming out of the Central America Wars, coming out of Cuba. So I'm going to stop because there are two other parts that I can do, but maybe I can talk about where the Zapatistas are today, and I have another briefer PowerPoint about, as Chuck mentioned, I retired this year. Happily, I retired on January 1st, 1994, in the Lacandon jungle, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Zapatistas, which seemed, utterly amazing that they were still around. And I do have a little PowerPoint that shows how crazy it was to arrive there. But I think I should stop and then we can, hear whether you have some questions, and then I can do that, or talk about Claudia Sheinbaum, what's going on in Mexico now. Okay. Somebody has a question. Yes? Yes?
Maybe I'm getting ahead of where you're going, but I'd just like to know an update, how they're doing now, what they're doing, what form it's taking, what challenges they've had in the last few years, and which direction they're going in.
Okay,
what
that
it
is
looks
actually, that is the topic of my next PowerPoint. So let me hear a few other questions, and if that's what, everybody is interested in, I'll do it. It's not that long. Okay, yeah. Yes?
You've spoken very eloquently about the Zapatista movement within Mexico. But is it ever broadened, exported, imprinted on other countries like the US or others?
Okay, I just take one more question and then answer those,
Go for it.
that, and then, yeah. Is there another question anywhere? Yes.
I'm wondering if the Zapatistas have had any solidarity or connection or encuentros with other indigenous-led movements or groups in other places.
First off, the Zapatistas have never sought to export their revolutionary practice. They've never seen themselves as a model. They've always insisted, as I said, the idea of the encuentro is not to teach others, but to learn from others who are in struggle from below and to the left. I'll tell you what that means in a minute. How they are encountering power. What power looks like from their vantage point and how they're resisting it. Right? So when they say from below and to the left, they don't invite just anybody to come and, kumbaya, but to the left means anti-capitalist and in struggle. And from below means they always take their ideas and their inspiration and their momentum from those below. And one of the campers, when I think I maybe mentioned this in some part of a talk I gave this week, said that resonated because when she goes about organizing and enters into a workspace, a tech workspace, and begins to organize, she's always been struck at how much the worker's imagination far outstrips hers. So that would be a very Zapatista expectation. And so, yeah, and in terms of connection to, they've been very serious about building an indigenous movement in Mexico, which had never existed, across, there's so many, there are multiple indigenous communities that haven't had necessarily any connection, and the Zapatistas have forged those multiple communities into the National Indigenous Congress. And they've invited people to come, and increasingly, I would say over the last 10 years, more and more indigenous from the US have come to their various encuentros and made those connections. And in terms of the rest of Latin America, indigenous movements, much less so. And part of that is because there's not the kind of mobility that we assume on anybody's part, not just the Zapatistas, but on the part of those other movements. However, I barely meet anybody of a certain age in Latin America who's mobilized and in struggle who doesn't talk about the way in which the Zapatistas impacted and their organizing, their youth, and so many young Latin Americans did make a trek to Chiapas. But I wouldn't say that indigeneity was what the link was.
Thank you. You began, or at least the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned NAFTA.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of the current conversation now, somewhat ironically, from the capitalists who want to protect the northern part of North America, have been very, very, very much against NAFTA and have seen it as detrimental to the working class in the United States. This is the
J.D. Vance.
the politics of Trump. But you mentioned that NAFTA is seen as unfortunate in the South, in Mexico. So my question is, are there two losers? And if so, how can that be?
Okay, I'm sure I can take anybody else before I try that one.
Both sides claim that it was a disaster. How can that be?
Well, I frankly think that the Republican Party's attack on NAFTA should be really understood as part of a kind of ethno-nationalist fantasy of making America great again by bringing back fossil fuel jobs like coal, etc. I don't believe for a second that there will be any effort on the part of the Republican administration to renegotiate NAFTA. Not at all, because they're too, NAFTA's now 30 years old. So it's the economies of Mexico and the US are too deeply entangled and entwined. And that's my view. Others may know more than I do, but I think it's a dog whistle, and it's one of our campers also pointed out that in the attack on Wall Street, there are a number of things going on, and one is, the sort of elevation of certain sectors of tech versus the old, financial power of Wall Street, but also maybe it's a slightly anti-Semitic, evocation. So, yeah. Yes?
Do you see any similarities between Kamala Harris and Claudia Sheinbaum?
Well, actually, yeah, I do have a whole rap on Kamala, and one of the similarities, I think, is that both of them are not completely profiled, because they've each been in the shadow of the president. So I think, I can tell you more about the ways I think Claudia might differ from AMLO, but I think what we're trying to figure out right now about Kamala is what the Mexicans are trying to figure out about Claudia. What's distinct about her, and I can tell you what some of the signs are, but I can come back to that one. What was the one I postponed? Oh, where are the Zapatistas now? Do you want me to do this quick thing? Okay. All right. How am I doing? Am I messing up with the first communique of invitation was issued. Oh, I think I have to do this first. The Zapatistas were, as is their practice, were silent for many, many, many months. And then in October, they issued a spate of communiques, like 24 of them, that culminated with the invitation in December to the January 1st anniversary. But I want to read to you from the first communique that they issued in October that broke their silence. The silence, as I said, has been a recurrent feature. They operate with a very different time sense than we have. Okay. The first communique addressed Gaza. And in fact, it was a reprint of a communique they had issued in 2009, and this is how it read. Perhaps our thoughts are very simple, and we lack the nuances and the always very necessary marginal notes in the analysis. But for us, Zapatistas, in Gaza, there's a professional army assassinating a defenseless population. Who, from below and to the left, can remain silent? Is it useful to say something? Do our screams stop any bombs? Is our word saving the life of a Palestinian child? We think that it is useful. Maybe we will not stop a bomb, nor will our word become an armored shield that prevents a 5.56 millimeter or 9 millimeter caliber bullet with the letters IMI, Israeli Military Industry, engraved on the base of the cartridge. It won't prohibit one of those bullets from reaching the chest of a girl or boy. But maybe our word will manage to join with others in Mexico and in the world. And maybe first it will become a murmur, then a loud voice, and then a cry that will be heard in Gaza. We don't know about you, but we Zapatistas of the EZLN know how important it is, in the midst of destruction and death, to hear a few words of encouragement. I don't know how to explain this, but it turns out that words from afar might not be enough to stop a bomb, but they are as if a crack opened in the black room of death for a small light to slip through. Otherwise, what will happen will happen. And then they conclude, this communique was called Of Sowing and Reaping. And they say, no one will ask who sowed what was reaped. So that was a communique they wrote in 2009, and they added to it. Those who were children then, almost 15 years ago, and who survived, Well, there are those who are responsible for sowing what is now being reaped, and there are those who with impunity repeat the sowing. Today in Palestine and Israel and all over the world, there are children and young people learning what terrorisms teach, that there are no limits, no rules, no laws, no shame, and no responsibilities. So that was the way they broke their silence, which is, to my mind, one of the most powerful statements on Gaza. So, who was convoked and how? And this is what they said. The Zapatista communities invite all people, groups, collectives, associations, and they're famous for these lists. You know, they really believe in singularity and not squishing differences together. Organizations and movements that sign the Declaration for Life. The indigenous people, the Sexta International, the NGOs that are defenders of human rights, and especially those whose destiny is artistic creation. We invite you all to the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the war against oblivion. Come, but we don't recommend it. You know, Chuck always laughs at this, but my best friend reminds me, you know, you're not 65 anymore. And I was like, oh my God, am I really going to do this? But yes. So it was the 30th anniversary was held in the Caracol Resistance and Rebellion, a new horizon that was inaugurated on recuperated land. And again, it is recommended to bring something to put between the floor and your battered anatomy at bedtime. Here, in addition to being dignified, the ground is hard, which I can attest to. So who was summoned by this crazy invitation? What motivates a group of activists from Valencia, Spain to realize a lightning voyage to the Mexican southeast to celebrate with the Zapatistas the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the insurrection? What pieces had to be in place for 90 indigenous delegates from different parts of Mexico to travel in a caravan to be together with their hermanos, their brothers? Why did students, activists, workers, buscadoras, and the buscadoras are the seekers, and they are a new political identity in Mexico. They're those who are seeking their disappeared children. Most of them are buscadoras, women, mothers. Not only children, brothers, sisters, husbands, etc. Buscadoras, artists, filmmakers, dancers, rockeros, and teatreros. What made them all feel summoned, along with a group of 14 activists from Atlanta fighting Cop City, who also came, and I can tell you some fallout from that. Whoops. All right, I'm not going to do this, but it's kind of wonderful. This is their assembling the. I'll just do a little bit. Building the tents and anyway, it gives you a sense that, you know, all of their projects, there's no NGO underwriting these. You know, they are literally doing all of it themselves. That was, I call that one assembling the encuentro. Now here's me arriving. I love this. There, you know, you're going through these gorgeous mountain roads, but in the middle of nowhere, and finally you get to this huge banner that says, "Wake up, sleepyheads, you're almost there." And so this is in terms of your deep question about where the Zapatistas are now. This set of communiques and this invitation have marked a new stage in the Zapatista forms of organization. They have eliminated their, what they call their good governing councils that govern their autonomous communities, because those were regional. And so they had representatives from all the small communities in a region that formed a good government council that met at the regional center, or Caracol. What they've done is reorganize at a very local level. And they have these new things called GAOs, local autonomous governments, and already they have signs for them. My understanding of why they've done that is because of the incredibly escalated threat of paramilitary and cartel violence. So they've had to reorganize so they're ready for self-defense and action and can take decisions at a very local level. Okay, what are you here for, they ask as you approach the caracol. Are you in or not? Oh, that's me. I think that's just proving I actually made it. Welcome to Dolores Hidalgo. And this is another new concept of the Zapatistas, tierra de nadie, de tierra de todos. Land that belongs to nobody, land that belongs to everybody. And that's really significant. What they've done is they've opened up space on recuperated land for Zapatista and non-Zapatista families to cultivate it. And the hope there is to both build bridges with non-Zapatistas at a moment when self-defense against encroaching and really violent militarization and cartel violence, has to be strengthened. The organization has to be strengthened. They call it Lo Común. And so this is just an image from most of the young people brought tents. I slept in one of those constructions that they made. Oops. One of the other, so it's this new, much more local, ready for action kind of organizational structure, and the opening up of common lands for cultivation. The other thing that the Zapatistas have decided to make a central focus of their organizing and educational structure is theater. And they've realized that 30 years since their uprising, there are 1 or 2 generations of young people who did not live the insurrection in their flesh and blood, who don't know about the period of clandestine organizing and the moment of the uprising. And so they've committed to dedicating all their educational resources and focus in the next year to theater to dramatize the history of the Zapatistas. And this is one of the theater pieces that the Zapatista secondary school students produced for the Encuentro. It's called The Train Maya, which is one of the mega development projects under the new leftist president that is, in the poorest and most indigenous regions of the country. And it means dispossession of the indigenous people, the Mayan people, so that the Mayan tourist train can be built. So they call the train Maya, their image is that it's carrying us to death. And these are los muertos, those who died in the wake of the train Maya. And then I won't do that one, but they just have wild sports competitions, and they're really fierce basketball and football players. Oops, if I can. All right. This was the December 31st. This was the stage, and we were all in the field around the stage. And it began with an empty scenario where space was left for all of those who are absent. Political prisoners, assassinated children, assassinated young people, et cetera, et cetera. All of those, so los ausentes, those who were not there. And this is the Zapatista militia. And from this angle, I don't know if you can see their weapons. They're sticks. They're not, and I have some, I might have to play. I call this the dance of the They love cumbia. This is, at night there was actually a dance. Just so you have some images of the celebration. She's a friend of mine, that's why I got that. Okay. So if you had dropped down into the Caracol Dolores Hidalgo in the Lacandon jungle on January 1st or December 31st, you would have thought that the Zapatistas were a movement of secondary school students who played sports, loved cumbia, and marched around with sticks in these weird formations of a militia that had no weapons. And so that was the experience. And it was a very, very moving, very welcoming experience. People described arriving after 8 or 10 hours in a caravan, but being greeted by the warm embrace of the Zapatistas. And one mother commented, and this was particularly meaningful to me, this was the first time in Mexico in recent years that she had felt safe when her children were out of her sight. So if I say that to communicate the incredible paradox, you know, this is, I mean, we were surrounded, it's absolutely gorgeous, we were surrounded by paramilitaries and the army and drug cartels that could have, presumably at any moment, entered and attacked. But I think we all felt completely safe under the protection of the Zapatista milicianos. So I don't know, those are, I don't know if that gives you some sense. It's a very, very precarious moment, I'd say. And I follow, I mean, the Fray Bartolomé de las Casas Center for Human Rights, and they do all their reports in English, so that's a place to find out, yeah. Yeah, so do you want me to talk about Claudia?
Yes.
Oh, don't be so excited, guys. I mean, I think maybe there's a momentary excitement. Maybe it's how we feel about Kamala. Okay, yeah, I do want to find my notes because there's some special things about it. Okay, we really don't know. Why, however, did she win by 30 points, right? In a country where, you know, all right, she's the first woman president in North America. And when I was writing an article about her coming to power, and I thought of that old Laurie Anderson song, you know, ¿Qué es más macho? The US or Mexico, a light bulb or a pineapple. Anyway, Mexico, the fact that Mexico elected a woman president well before the US is of some significance. And not only that, a Jewish woman president, right? In a country where women only gained the vote in the 50s, but where since 2018 there is gender parity across the board in Mexican politics as the result of feminist struggles. So 50% at least of all you know, representatives in the Congress, the cabinet, etc., have to be women. Okay. So the legacy, she won on the very, very popular legacy of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, and what he calls, modestly, the fourth transformation. He believes that his government represents the fourth historical transformation of Mexico, equivalent to the 19th century liberal reform, the War of Independence, the Mexican Revolution, and AMLO's fourth transformation of Mexico. What does it consist in? A very contradictory project, a genuine, sort of, not even Keynesian because it's not based on taxes, but a project of social welfare, significant social welfare that has made the lives of millions of Mexicans much more livable. Old age pensions, they're going to be expanded to housewives. That is, they're not going to be simply based on having had formal employment, and so many Mexicans, you know, didn't have formal employment. So you can imagine how incredible that is. Like the creation of Social Security at a, you know, national level, all sorts of programs for youth, scholarship programs, etc. So that's that kind, and Claudia is going to extend, you know, and keep increasing those sorts of very, very popular, you know, long delayed, overdue social democratic reforms. On the other hand, his other development strategy is these huge mega projects, and they are completely heedless, or have been till now, of the environmental consequences. And in the wake of these projects, one is the Mayan train, and the other is the Trans-Isthmus Canal that wants to compete with the Panama Canal connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. And each one of these requires the military to precede it because it involves, displacing and dispossessing people and destroying the environment. So those are two facets of what the fourth transformation means. The third facet is the deep militarization of the society. Everything in Mexico is militarized right now. The army is in power. It's in charge of the Mayan train. The army's been given these big mega projects. The Navy's in charge of the ports. And the army especially has really been declared by AMLO, been granted total impunity. And there's the famous case of Ayotzinapa where 43 students were disappeared, and all the independent investigations pointed to the army, and AMLO just issued a report saying they're based on complete falsehoods, and the army was not implicated, which is a flat out lie and a declaration that the army will be protected no matter what. So that is pretty alarming. The tally of missing or disappeared persons, estimated at more than 100,000, grew by 50,000 during AMLO's term. Okay, so these are all the grim things. One thing that we might expect from Claudia, she's a serious climate scientist, very serious. And she claims that she's going to make the water problem a priority. She worked, what is that, UN thing, IPCC, the International Program on Climate Change. She worked with them and was part of a team that got the Nobel Prize in 2007. She also worked with somebody called Mario Molina, who's the only Mexican scientist to ever win a Nobel Prize. So she has deep and serious understanding of the climate issues and some greater commitment than AMLO to addressing them. How much, we don't know. She supported LGBTQ rights. This is my favorite thing that she did as mayor of Mexico City. She eliminated the school uniform policy, which required that boys wear pants and girls wear skirts. And now all Mexican children, at least in Mexico City, can wear whatever they want. Boys can wear dresses and girls can wear skirts, can wear pants. Imagine that, girls had to wear skirts to school until last year. What else? Okay. This is the moment I've been waiting for. One place where she's really clearly different from AMLO is Israel-Palestine. So, I don't know if you follow this, I doubt it, but Mexico has joined South Africa's case before the International Court of Justice investigating the charge of genocide, but AMLO has refused publicly to name Israel's war a genocide. Claudia is likely to be unequivocal. She's Jewish, her paternal grandparents were Lithuanian, exiled in the 20s for reasons, quote, economic, racial, and political. Her grandfather was Jewish and a communist. Her maternal grandparents were Bulgarian Jews who fled Nazi persecution. She has said that her identification is with the political traditions of Judaism, not so much the religion. Neither she nor her parents were members of a synagogue. And the small Jewish community of Mexico, which is about 50,000 in a population of 126 million, tends conservative politically and did not support her. In 2009, at the time of Israel's Operation Cast Lead, she published a letter in the Mexican left-wing daily La Jornada in which she took a position, quote, "Because of my Jewish origin, because of my love for Mexico, and because I feel myself a citizen of the world, I share with millions the desire for justice, equality, fraternity, and peace, and therefore I can only watch with horror the images of the bombings of the Israeli state in Gaza. No reason justifies the murder of Palestinian civilians. Nothing can justify the murder of a child. That is why I join the cry of millions around the world calling for a ceasefire and the immediate withdrawal of Israeli troops from Palestinian territory. As Alberto Sprungberg, an Argentine poet, said in a recent letter, That is what it is all about. Saving a world, this unique and anguished world that we all inhabit, that belongs to all of us, and that today is called Gaza. So that was Claudia in 2009, and as I said, AMLO, way more equivocal. She will be, I think, very clear and unequivocal. So on that note, which is the happiest one, talk informally, and I encourage you to buy the book because all proceeds go to the Zapatistas. How much did I brought them? One of the reasons I went to the encuentro was to hand deliver money, from the sales of the book, and I think it was over $2,000, which is more than any of my academic books ever earned. Yes.
The former president Obrador legislated that Russian and Ukrainian people will not be deported from Mexico until the conflict in between Russia and Ukraine finished. Will Claudia Sheinbaum continue this legislation?
I have no idea. I don't know what motivated it on Almo's part. I imagine so. I don't see why she. Maybe you can help me understand it.
I have another question.
Okay.
Recently, like a few weeks, recent week, Moreno, the party that is governing right now in Mexico, legislated that transfemicide, which is killing of transgendered women, is punishable by 70 years of jail in Mexico City. Do you think that Claudia will try to protect transgender people federally in whole Mexico and not only in Mexico City?
That would be helpful. I wrote because I was doing this talk. I wrote to all my feminist friends and said in Mexico, so what do you think? It's very, very divided, and her record was very mixed. And she first repressed. There's been a new feminist movement in Mexico since about 2016, I would say. The old feminist movement became super institutionalized. We would say NGOized, etc. This young movement is a street movement. It's an anarchist movement. It was successfully, I think, agitated for abortion, etc. Claudia, as mayor of the city of Mexico, was willing to let the military attack them. She wasn't as bad as AMLO, who said that the feminists in Mexico were organized by the opposition to undermine his government. And she did meet with a group of feminists after that repression and apologized. But in the most recent stuff I found, feminists say that there's somebody who's transphobic in her cabinet. They're pretty upset about that. And she hasn't staked a clear position on feminicide. And there's this distinction in Spanish between femicide, which means the killing of women because they're women, because of misogyny, and feminicide, which means the killing of women that goes along with impunity, that nobody's ever punished for it. That is, the state protects. Those like 90-some% of femicides are not prosecuted in Mexico, which means feminicide. So it's a very hard call, and I mean I can link you to some trans activists, etc., who I guess I'll be following to see. I don't think people know yet. Just one wonderful thing just happened in Mexico. I don't think Claudia had anything to do with it. Parteros, who are midwives, traditional midwives, who are super, super important. Not only, everybody I know had their child delivered by a midwife, a partera, but more so and completely in rural communities, indigenous communities. And the traditional parteras have just been recognized at a federal level, and that they don't have to prove through any kinds of credentials their capacities, because their authority is seen to derive from their communities. And as long as their communities recommend them and recognize them and authorize them, they are being considered part of the national health system, which that's a huge victory. It means, and also the way it's formulated. Their authority comes not from credentials issued by the state, but from their communities, so, yeah. So I don't know is the answer. It's like there are a lot of unknowns, but certainly more hopeful than it has been. I mean, yeah. So, yes. Yeah.
So I don't know too much about this, but the Zapatistas today, you showed them with sticks knocking do they believe in violence to any degree as self-protection, or
Yes.
would they ever go out and link up with other indigenous groups through violence, or just for self-protection, or what do they believe in?
Well, they said, I wish somewhere I have it, Commandante Marco says we're not going out looking to kill soldiers, but if they attack us, we will defend ourselves. That's their position. Soldiers and, I mean, the real issue is not just feminicide, the impunity for those who kill women, but the impunity for the drug cartels. That hasn't been, well, the impunity, they're all linked with different branches of the state. So yeah, they're under threat, they know that. They're the most organized of all the indigenous communities in Mexico, and they believe they have the right to defend themselves. Do you want to talk informally, or are there more questions? Yeah?